a nuke hub. And so here I'm going to go over a simple evenly weighted timeless cup ranker. And so the first question you may be asking is, what is the timeless cup? So the timeless cup came out Sunday. It will be starting December 1st, going until January 8th. And we've got some interesting concepts for team building. So for the first mon, you choose one elemental starter from Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, or Sinnoh. These are your first 3 evolutionary lines in the decks. For each of them, your grass, water, and fire types. This does not include, according to the arena staff in the Discord, starters like Pikachu or Eevee and their families. And so it's just the 3 types: grass, water, and fire, and then the secondary typings that come after that. And then these starters are exempt from the type restrictions over here. So Blaziken is allowed even though it's a fighting type, as long as it's your one starter. You also do have to have a starter according to the wording in this. The other 5 members of your team are Gen 1 through 4 Pokemon that don't have these restrictions. So they're not any of these types. It's not Umbreon or Sableye, and they're not legendary or mythical, as well as no Alolan or Galarian forms and no Unova Pokemon at all. And so that's the basics of the Timeless Cup. We can go over to PvPoke here and check out the rankings. Alright, and so here we can toggle limited Pokemon or not. And so this gives us a bit of an idea as to the meta, where it stands just from the very beginning. And so, as per usual, if you're new to the channel, I've downloaded a whole bunch of CSVs from PvPoke and put them in my model, which simulates team battles. So it takes all the teams of 3 that are possible and puts them against all the other teams of 3, and then collates all of that information into some rankings. So the new thing with this model is this little function right here. So I've added a little function that determines restrictions. Only one Pokemon, one starter is allowed on your 6-mon team, which means that at maximum you have one Pokemon, or one starter, sorry, on your 3-mon team. And so essentially I've got a little function here that tells me, based on this list of restricted mons, are there more than one? If so, it's a restricted team. And so pretty well, that's the major changes. We go through and we simulate. At the moment, I've got 45 teams, or 45 mons being simulated right now. The limitation here being memory. I only have access to about 20 gigs of memory right now, and the cutoff for that is somewhere between 45 and 50. So I take the top 45 mons from these rankings. So basically stopping here at Relicanth, sorry Quagsire, and then I simulate all of them. And so this is the table of the individual values, basically all of the information from PvPoke put in one table, and then using the simplified model that I have created and is explained in several other videos, we simulate a 1.3 billion battles, which is even after you take out the restricted teams. There's quite a bit in this particular model. It's a very close battle. 1499.5. That's probably the closest I've seen. In this model, 1500 is a tie. And so our number of wins here is not as Gaussian as they usually are. It's interesting. I think, yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on there. But let's just get into the team rankings here. Trying to make sure. Yeah, okay. So that doesn't have any effects from the starter restrictions. That is exactly how it should be. Okay. And so we've got this team rankings here. And your number one team at the moment with evenly weighted mons, only considering the top 45, is Dragonair, Swampert, Haunter, which is an interesting choice. You might notice that this entire column is Dragonair as your lead, except for the 30th team, which is Lapras, and presumably further down you go, you get different leads as well. The second team is Dragonair, Lapras, Banette, Swampert, Lapras, Charizard, Banette, Lapras, Whiscash. A note here, you can't have the third and fourth best team within your 6-mon team because of the different starters here. Some more Whiscash. Flygon joins the ranks here. Shelgon. Venomoth. Muck. Quite a variety. Meganium, Venusaur, Gloom. I mean, we're adding a new mon to those considered in the top 30 teams. Almost every team. Drapion here. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of variety in this meta. So if we look at the best team here by number of wins, we've got Dragonair, Swampert, Haunter. And then the worst team is Dustox, Ivysaur, and Wormadam of the plant variety. That's by number of wins. And so we can collate all that information together into a ranking for individual mons. Now this is a win percentage, and that is specifically dividing by the number of teams that each mon can be on. So for Swampert, we're dividing by a smaller number because it's on a smaller number of teams, and that basically just puts them on the same scale. And so we end up actually in this, if you're interested, dividing by the number of teams that it's on times the number of teams that there are, and then dividing that by 100 before dividing the number of wins by that, and that will give us our win percentage. So Dragonair wins in 88% of the teams that it's on, Swampert at 87%. So some interesting things to look at here. Swampert is your number one water starter. Down here, Charizard is your number one fire starter, and Meganium is your number one grass starter. Which is interesting because in PvPoke, Venusaur is ranked number one, but Meganium is not incredibly far behind at third place. Charizard is number one fire, and Swampert is number one water, so pretty solid agreement there. Polytoad is way higher. That's down in the 30s, I believe. Yeah, 32 in PvPoke, and that's quite a ways up in this model. In fact, a lot of your water types are pretty high here. Whiscash, Lapras fills a little bit of a different role. Polytoad, Relicanth, Rainy Cat's form in 9th is an interesting placement there. And then quite a bit until we see our next water type, which is a water ice, which again fills a little bit of a different role here. And so if we plot the number of wins versus, or your win percentage here versus your PvPoke ranking, we get a very noisy downward trend. And so in this, the data is still very, very early, and so this model and PvPoke disagree on quite a bit, but over time, I suspect that will start to change. And if we take a look at the top team by this model versus the top team by PvPoke, if you were to just, which isn't the top team that PvPoke suggests, that's not what I'm saying. It's just, if you were to take the top team of 3 that were possible to create straight out of PvPoke without any regards to forming a balanced team, and the first one you could choose is Venusaur, Dragonair, and then you have to skip all of these starters and go down to Kingdra. And so that's what is done here. And if we compare that to this model, we see that this model does take into account some team effects that you wouldn't get if you just take it straight from PvPoke. Again, we get this not quite Gaussian curve. If we go into the mean score, and then again, Dragonair is your #1 lead, with the exception of this one Banette. This Banette here is a shadow Pokemon, or it was a shadow Pokemon. It's a purified Pokemon. It has to have return, and it has to have pretty bad stats to be able to get return. So just keep that in mind. And our top team here is Dragonair, Swampert, Victory Bell in terms of score. It's pretty interesting. Dragonair, Charizard, Flygon, not far behind. Pretty well alternating between Charizard and Swampert for quite a ways. Here's a non-starter team, Dragonair, Flygon, Victory Bell. Trying to find a grass starter, but it doesn't appear that there is one in the top 30 teams by mean score. Let me go up to number of wins and see if that's the case. Yeah, no, there's Meganium here for sure. I think that's, and a Venusaur. A couple of Venusaurs there. But by mean score, they don't show up very much, though other grass types do. Victory Bell is up here. So that's interesting. And then we can, of course, check the best versus the worst in terms of the #1 team versus the last team. That's Dragonair, Swampert, and Victory Bell versus Dustox, Ivysaur, Wormadam of the plant variety. And that's actually the same worst team as the last one. The best team has changed a little bit here. And we can also look at the individual rankings. Pretty similar to the last one. Not a lot of changes drastically here. If we check average score versus the PvPoke rankings, it's not an incredibly strong correlation, but there definitely is what appears to be a downward trend, I would say. Much stronger correlation here between our average score and our number of wins. It's fairly obvious just looking through the teams. And then we've got a number of other things in this model, variance, skewness, and kurtosis that don't matter quite as much when it comes to creating a team. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to leave those out for now. But let's go back up to the rankings. So these are some good Pokemon to choose for the Timeless Cup. I think, and this is personal opinion, not the data that's coming from the model necessarily, but the fact that Swampert is the #1 starter, I don't think necessarily means that Swampert should be your starter. I think that the fact that there are other Pokemon of the same type, and therefore generally the same role, like Whiscash, or even Politoed can fill that role, are really high ranked. Whereas, for instance, Charizard here is the #1 ranked fire type. You don't get down to another fire type until Blaziken here, which can't be used if you're using it another starter, or Houndoom down here at 17th. So that's just something to consider. Same thing with the grass types. So Meganium starts here, and then there's Venusaur. But we gotta go all the way down to Gloom at 22nd before we get the next best grass type. But these grass types are ranked lower. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. It's not necessarily obvious which one you should pick, and I think that that's some purpose in the design. Because if it were obvious, then you would have one Pokemon that would be easy to choose and counter, and then the meta would be a little less interesting. And so I think that was a pretty solid design choice there. And these are my initial rankings. Given that I'm considering the top 45 and everything is evenly weighted. Once I get the Silph API up, which will happen December 1st, we can look at some actual frequency statistics, and I'm looking forward to also doing some clustering analysis on this, which is also featured a little bit in my last video. So check that out.